On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the U.S. Treasury proposes new regulations on foreign investment. Will the business community accept the added red tape? And Premier Li Keqiang meets President Putin to celebrate the anniversary of China-Russia ties. After 70 years, where will the relationship head next? And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program in the United States, where the government outlined plans to extend scrutiny of foreign investment. The proposed regulations will give greater power to the Committee on Foreign Investment for so-called national security reasons. What impact will this decision have on the U.S. economy and the global market, and especially the fate of foreign investors? Before we get down to the discussion between the Chinese and the U.S. side, let's take a look at this first.
The U.S. Treasury Department on Tuesday proposed new regulations on foreign investment in U.S. companies involved in technology, infrastructure, and sensitive data. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said today's proposed regulations will provide clarity and certainty to investors regarding CFIUS's enhanced authorities to address national security risks that arise from certain foreign investments and continue modernizing the CFIUS process. CFIUS, or the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, is a multi-agency panel that reviews certain transactions involving foreign investment in U.S. companies. The proposed regulations this time will grant CFIUS excessive discretionary power. One proposal will allow CFIUS to scrutinize bids by foreigners to purchase property located within 100 miles of military installations or sensitive government facilities. Under another proposal, filings will be mandatory if a foreign government has at least a 49% stake in a company investing in the U.S. Many foreign investors are concerned these proposals could obstruct even normal transactions on the ground of national security. In fact, the Trump administration has increased barriers to trade and investment by expanding the definition of national security since taking office. This time the public will have until October 17th to comment on the proposed regulations, and a final version of the rule will take effect earlier next year.
For more on the latest about the U.S. foreign investment regulations, we have in Washington, D.C., Bruce Fein, former Associate Deputy Attorney General and the General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., Arthur Dong, Professor at Georgetown University's McDonald School of Business. And also joining us in Beijing, Liao Fan, Professor and Director of the Department of International Cooperation at the Institute of International Law, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. First of all, Mr. Fein, would you like to help us understand the latest reading, or shall I say regulations, related to FIRMA, which was a piece of legislation put out last year regarding the future and the potential of foreign investors in the United States?
Yes, the CFIUS process has been around for several decades, but the Congress and the administration believed it didn't cover as wide a sweep of investments that were thought to endanger national security. And that concern was clearly raised by Chinese telecommunications companies buying or doing business in the United States. It came in conjunction with the Russian interference with the 2016 elections. And as a result, Congress passed a statute entrusting CFIUS with a broader array of transactions for review. And what that means is that before any foreign investor can consummate a transaction, a purchase, a joint venture, it must get a national security clearance from CFIUS, which can take anywhere from months to even years. And moreover, because the definition of national security is so elusive, it's very difficult to plan on whether or not you will ever get approval. And of course, substantial financial investments and time have to be undertaken before you can even create a proposal. So the result is going to be this kind of a pre-screening before anything is finalized will severely deter investments in the United States, and I believe set back the economy and our entrepreneurial efforts here.
I see. Professor Dong, now, as Mr. Feng earlier illustrated to a certain degree, the concept of national security could be quite elusive or abstract. It really up to the so-called readings to clarify, and yet with the latest reading up for public opinion, it is still unclear many of the aspects. So, Professor Dong, what can we expect from something like this?
Yes, I certainly would agree with Mr. Fine in the manner in which he sort of established the context around this current debate. This sort of broadening in terms of the interpretation of what constitutes a potential security threat to the United States has now been given broad authority. It's, in other words, being written in such a way that is not very specific, but so broad as to invite very broad interpretative opinions on the part of American, governmental entities in terms of what they define as a national security, threat.
Mr. Liao, may I go to you and ask that question too? If you can just look at the camera right in front of you, sir. What exactly would that mean for foreign investors? Because on the one hand, you have this further reading of the earlier legislation called FIRMA, which is mainly putting a lot of limits to foreign investors. On the other hand, the administration right now is saying, oh, we welcome foreign investors, come and invest in the United States. So do you find that contradictory with one another?
Well, I guess we need to make sure that, as my colleagues have mentioned just now, what does the concept national security really means? Actually, it has been expanding over time. Actually, in the past, it's mainly focused on military aspects, but since 2007, it has been expanded to, let's say, cover those areas like technology, like infrastructure, especially, after the 2018 statute, the so-called FIRMA. The power of the CFIUS has been greatly expanded, and they can review much wider scope of investment, and they can, if they like, give longer review time. So on one hand, you said we welcome the investment, but on the other hand, you have this expanding concept of national security with a lot of discretion vested in the CFIUS. I don't think that's a really gesture of goodwill towards the foreign investors.
I see. Well, maybe the Chinese foreign investors feel so, but what about the reasons behind this? Mr. Feng, at this point, many in China, and certainly the company Huawei itself, believes there is not sufficient evidence that has been presented by the U.S. side at all, since it claimed Huawei as a national security threat to the United States. Now, that were not even believed by many of the business partners Huawei has inside the United States either. So how should we understand now the interpretation of national security and the chance of manipulating the concept of national security for whatever reason by whichever department and whoever individual?
Well, the problem we have is this is not a transparent process. The CFIUS process is not open. There's not a proceeding where there's presentations made where there's sunshine from the media or otherwise. It's all made in dark rooms, so they don't have to give a reason why a national security. They just pronounce a decree. We're stopping this. I recall years ago, Dubai ports wanted to run some of the port and the revenue systems in the United States when the hysteria against anti-Islamic nation was at its zenith because of the various and sundry terrorist acts. And it was prohibited from investing in these Dubai ports. It was a political decision. And I think what the elusiveness of national security and the darkness of the decision-making process means is that this is going to be completely infected by politics. You can bet if Saudi Arabia makes an investment, then they're buying tons of billions or $100 billions of dollars worth of weapons, it'll get approved. China wants to do the same investment, and it won't get approved because we are used right now are in tension with China, not only with regard to tariffs and quotas, the South China Sea, relations with Taiwan and selling weapons to them. And so it makes the whole process so politicized that no foreign investor can count on CFIUS ever approving anything.
But Mr. Fain, I mean, you are a constitutional lawyer to begin with, besides serving in the earlier administrations. I mean, what would this enlargement, shall we say, of political power in pinning down the nature of a lot of investment mean for the so-called rule of law, which is a principle that the Americans throughout history has been holding quite dearly to? What does that mean? And will there be counterforce in the country to question about this?
Well, it will cripple the idea of the rule of law. You know, it's secret. There's no fair opportunity to respond or appeal the CFIUS decisions. Unfortunately, in my judgment, our United States Supreme Court, when the president cries national security, backs away and lets the president do things unilaterally and in secret that really are unacceptable in a rule of law country. And it's a one additional measure of deterioration of the rule of law. I mean, a companion area is in the national security decision the president made to impose all these economic quotas and tariffs unilaterally, and he's imposing them, removing them at whim. One day it's 10, 25% expanded, then he retracts them, and there's no guidelines, there's no decision-making process to know why it's one thing rather than another. So I do think that this is a very worrisome step that the United States has taken away from the rule of law, not only in the economic realm, but across the board.
But Professor Dong, even though it could sound just like Mr. Fain illustrated, like a children's game, you know, whatever you like of the day, you would do it, and then everybody will have to bear with the consequences. But the fact is, everybody does have to bear with the consequences, especially foreign investors. China, of course, is a big part of it. We know what is the real intention of the recent CFIUS firmer action. So, Professor Dong, it's not just about the national security concept itself. It's also about, you know, what about the economic and trade cooperation between China and the United States, the legitimate cooperation between the two sides, the historically important cooperation with the two sides. For example, with the latest reading, there are even new rules regarding so-called the real estate project. Let me just read part of it that I have found in some of the media coverage excerpts. For example, those that are in close proximity to military installation, which is understandable, but to airports, to ship ports, should be reconsidered. Now, who wants to have a real estate project that's far away from the airport, that's far away from the road, that's far away from the shipping ports, and in nowhere? Nobody wants to have that. So what would that mean for, you know, very usual business operations and deals, Professor Dong? I'm just puzzled.
Yes, Tian, that's a very important point that you make, and I would agree again with Mr. Fine in the comments that he provided to us earlier, is that this is certainly going to create a chilling effect in terms of the impact of foreign direct investment into the United States moving forward. We've already seen, as a result of the trade war, a significant drop of Chinese foreign direct investment into the United States over the past 12 months. These new rules are certainly not going to help that, and indeed are probably going to slow that down. Another piece of evidence that suggests that the linking of the economies between the United States and China is continuing. What really is also troubling is the fact that you're seeing a lot more the injection of potential subjectivity into this review process rather than objectivity. And I think that's perhaps would be very concerning to a lot of companies.
This is confusing, Mr. Liao, because the U.S. President, Mr. Trump himself, is a real estater. So he knows what it means to be convenient when it comes to infrastructure. Your real estate projects should be, right? Think about Trump buildings. Should they be all far away from the railroads and the highways and the airports and also the shipping ports? Probably that's very hard for him and his family to imagine. I'm just giving one example. So, Mr. Liao, what do you make of things like these? How should foreign investors understand this?
My personal understanding is that actually this kind of phrasing, this kind of wording is actually trying to give the CFIUS a lot of discretion to do whatever they want to do. For example, if you are investing in real estate, let's say if you are investing in Trump building,
okay,
they can decide. Let's say it's within a 1 to 100 miles the scope, but they can decide whether it's a threat to national security. They can say, okay, it is a national security,
right.
But they can say, no, it's not based on our judgment. So in this way, they gave them broader power and a lot of more discretion to make a decision that is not transparent and cannot be, reviewed by the judicial system. They enjoy a lot of discretion.
I see. It is not just a real estate project, Mr. Fain. There's also so-called information regarding personal health and data concerned here. For example, those that are more than 1 million people's data that being collected, or those data that are coming from federal employees who are in the fields of so-called national security. Now, once again, this concept of national security is very flexible. You could be working in any government department or related projects and being termed as national security matters. So what would that mean for individuals also in the United States in terms of your choices of having where to go to for your medical care or things like that? What does that mean? Would that be an excuse for a monopoly in a way?
Well, when you have these limits, you have to remember the political dynamism is that there are certain elements in the United States that profit by the deterrence of foreign investment. They don't want competition. They have political clout. They make political donations. If you're a foreign investor, you're prohibited from making foreign donations, and you don't have a vote. So the political process is tilted against foreign investment. But you raise a very intriguing questions with regard to an employee involved in any dimension that would have a national security implication. What about if you're just maybe not an employee, a student who is learning high energy physics that could be used in nuclear development, like the way in which we developed the atomic bomb? Does it mean that we're going to hold off anybody who is involved in any kind of enterprise where the employee has to acquire a certain kind of scientific knowledge that could be useful? It had dual use for civilian and military purposes. Then that's an excuse for a CFIUS veto. It's so broad that I say it permits CFIUS to block virtually anything. And I want to underscore again, because CFIUS doesn't need to write an opinion in that's subject to open scrutiny, it just says no. It foments the manipulation of the system for pure political purposes, which is the opposite of the rule of law.
Now, there's one thing that is very important in here. That is one clause of the reading of the so-called formal law related to CFIUS power has a lot to do with exemptions. Yet, Professor Dong, there has not been clear specifications as to which country, under what circumstances, or what kinds of businesses, what kinds of deals that will be exempted, and therefore leaving even bigger room for interpretation as the one who exercised the reading would like. That would make people question about the biased tendency of the U.S. regulations and even legislations. How should we understand this trend? Will others also follow suit? Should other countries retaliate against the United States as a result of this?
Yes, Tian, this certainly the manner in which this has been written certainly can potentially invite further retaliation. There are two types of discrimination, de jure and de facto. So on the face of the law, it doesn't seem like it's discriminating against any single country. But de facto, in terms of the actual factual impact of this type of the broadened scope of this regulation, certainly could be used to target certain countries, certainly China included.
So, if a reading of the law and the law itself is so flexible that it could be interpreted in such a way that could be having a negative effect on certain countries, certain businesses, or certain individuals. So, Mr. Liao, would other economies retaliate For example, China? Should China retaliate? I understand in the latest foreign investment law that China put out recently, there are specifications in terms of legal clause suggesting that China could also establish a system to specify about foreign investment. So is that China's way of reacting? How is China looking at this tendency, particularly in the near future with the United States?
Actually, we already have a national security review system.
I know.
But actually, we have used it in quite a reasonable, in my opinion, reasonable and restrained way. We have not had so much discretion vested in any of those departments involved. And we have not, exercised so much power. We have not had so many cases as the U.S. have done. And I don't want that this would be a bad example for other countries, including China, to follow, because that's actually is not good to any of us. So I have to say, we would all use the rule of law spirit to try to have a, better solution to this, instead of like we retaliate against each other, because that would be a endless, cycle. Sadly.
Well, of course, foreign investors in China also have different issues that they have in discussion with the Chinese government and Chinese regulations as well, Mr. Liao. But having said that, I want to ask a general one of you gentlemen, if I can. If the United States, which is the largest economy in the world, and an economy that has been proud in terms of the rule of law, is going down in this path, would this be a bad example for other economies to follow, both toward the U.S. and toward one another and among themselves? What would that mean to all of us? Mr. Fain, we got 30 seconds for every one of you.
Well, it's a bad example. I think it reduces the total economic pie for everyone. I think the United States is shooting itself in the foot, and other countries should resist the example, because they will then attract the entrepreneurship and foreign investment that will cause their economies boost, because the United States has a sign out saying no vacancy.
I see. Professor Dong.
Yeah, just another manifestation of the closure of the American mindset with regard to this question of globalization, and certainly the momentum towards delinking of the U.S. economy from the rest of the world seems to be continuing on.
Mr. Liao, your thoughts finally before we go.
I don't like this kind of thing that the U.S. is doing now. Actually, kind of reminded me of the 1930s, when every country tries to, transfer their problems to other countries by imposing tariffs and other kind of things. I don't think this is a good way in this globalization period of time.
Liao Fan, Arthur Dong, Bruce Fain, thank you so much, gentlemen, for helping us to understand better about exactly what it means. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, the program coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come on our show today. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang meets Russian President Vladimir Putin to celebrate the anniversary of China-Russia ties. After 70 years, where will the relationship head next? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang is in St. Petersburg for regular talks with Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. They are expected to strengthen their bilateral ties through a series of agreements on trade, energy, technology, and other areas. The two sides will also talk about lifting restrictions on the exports of Russian food products to China. And let's take a look at some of the latest.
China-Russia relations are on an upward momentum. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang was greeted by Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. Officials on both sides are optimistic about expanding economic cooperation at a time when China and the U.S. are engaged in a trade war. Last year, bilateral trade between China and Russia reportedly exceeded $100 billion. Putin congratulated what he referred to as his Chinese friends in recognition of the 70th anniversary of the establishment of China-Russia diplomatic ties.
I would like to underscore that in the past decades we have come a long way in the history of our bilateral cooperation. Today we are strategic partners in the full sense of that word, and we maintain our comprehensive cooperation. It's an unconditional priority of Russian foreign policy.
Li, in his address, focused on the importance of collaboration between the two countries.
Our cooperation contributes not only to the development of our countries, but to the development of the region and the whole world, especially in the context of growing instability and uncertainty in the region and in world economy.
The meeting with Putin came after a two-day visit to St. Petersburg, where the two sides reached a number of agreements. While some say the two countries have strengthened ties due to necessity, others say that it is the only possible rational way forward.
The Chinese Premier earlier meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. For more on China-Russia ties, in Moscow we have Yuri Tavrovsky, Director of the Russian Idea and Chinese Idea Analytic Center. In Beijing we have Deepening Li, Deputy Director of the Institute of European Studies, China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. A friend in need is a friend indeed, as they say. Mr. Liu, how should we understand that Asian wisdom exercise itself today in China-Russia relations, rather? Mr. Liu.
I think it is widely believed that China and Russia are seeing the best time of bilateral relations in history. We know just earlier this year, Chinese President Xi Jinping has visited Russia, and right after this, Chinese Premier visited Russia again with concrete result. I think also this year is also the 70th anniversary of the diplomatic relations. It's a very important year, and all these signals shows that China and Russia really enjoy very good cooperation with each other.
Okay, we have anniversaries before, we have also state visits as well, but what is even more important this year, there are a lot of concrete cooperation opportunities and even deals. Mr. Tavrovsky, to you, what are some of the most important ones?
I'm sorry?
Cooperation between the two sides, concrete deals. What are the important ones to you?
Yes. You know, our relations are a strategic partnership with the definite accent on the first word, strategic. So our relations in security field is predominant until now, for good or for worse. For me, cooperation, strategic cooperation is very important because now we live in a very dangerous world. America is stopping all the barriers on the way to the nuclear catastrophe. So China and Russia demonstrate their will for keeping the world safe and secure.
Okay, so what does that mean? Instead of talking abstract, Mr. Tavrovsky, what does that mean in terms of real deals of cooperation between the two sides? What areas do you consider as most important when translating so-called strategic into real issues?
Well, first of all, I think that strategic issues are very real in the present world. In terms of trade, yes, we have reached $107 billion turnover last year. And our leaders promised that by the year 2024 it will be $200 billion. And it is, of course, quite real, because we know that both in Moscow and in Beijing, the political decisions are very important. When President Xi Jinping promises President Trump that the trade problems will be solved in 100 days, and trade will get more $100 billion.
it's a reality. When President Trump comes to Beijing and he has promised $256 billion deals, it is also a reality.
Okay.
So I can imagine that Chairman Xi and President Putin also can make decisions, and these 200 billions will be a reality by the year 2024.
Of course, it seems that what Mr. Tavrovsky, Mr. Liu, was trying to suggest is not just between the two countries, but also there are other parties that the two countries are interacting in front of, for example, the United States. So what do you think, Mr. Liu, looking at the so-called strategic, which is a word Mr. Tavrovsky would love to use repeatedly?
Yes, we have seen China and Russia are now comprehensive strategic partners of coordination. To my understanding, this kind of bilateral relationship is beyond traditional cooperation. China and Russia used to be energy providers and importers, and China used to export clothes and other industrialized goods to Russia. But from this visit, we can see that the cooperation is beyond these traditional areas. For example, technological cooperation is an important part, and we also, the two sides want to cooperate in aviation area, and also agricultural cooperation is also important, particularly under the background of global trade tensions, particularly the trade tensions between China and the U.S. If we add this together, we can find that this kind of relationship between China and Russia is beyond bilateral. It have significance for global issues.
For those who do not necessarily follow what China and Russia are doing together every day, Mr. Liu, we might want to explain to them exactly what about the agricultural products, for example. A sensitive word, beans, being mentioned between the two sides. That's quite interesting. China will import these products coming from Russia.
Yes, soybeans is very important for Chinese. China, we know, is a very important importer of soybeans. But during the past 2 years, U.S. used to be a very important provider of soybeans, but the trade tensions made this kind of trade very complicated. And we have seen that Russia has export to China in terms of soybeans. If my memory is good, last year the export from Russia to China in terms of soybeans has increased by over 60%. It's very important. It has significance. If this trend continues, which means Russia will have a bigger and bigger share of Chinese soy market, which means U.S. may lose part of China's market, this huge market.
Or at least face much fierce competition from different countries, China, Russia included.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
What about the technology part? Exactly what are some of the technologies that China and Russia will work together, given the fact that over the past decades, Russia has been very strong in terms of technological development, particularly during the earlier years. So what would that mean for the potential of real long-term technological cooperation, Mr. Liu?
Yes, Russia has some advantages in terms of technology, but China is also climbing up in the value chain. China's economic structure has been enhanced or has updated during the past decades. China also has some advantages. For example, Chinese cars are popular in Russia. We can find that during President Xi's visit a few months ago, and we can also see China also have advantage in terms of digital economy. For example, International Plus, which also have some experience that Russia can consider.
So, Mr. Tavrovsky, what would that mean? China have been able to develop a technology in such a speed that it could also provide Russia with different kinds of options. What does that mean to the overall structure of trade and, as you said, strategic relationship between the two countries?
Well, I think that China is really world famous for example, 5G technologies, which Russia can import. and is very much interested in. At the same time, I think that some Russian military technologies are #1 in the world. Even the United States don't have some rocket technologies, cyber technologies, which we can also provide China. And there are other technical experts and imports we can exchange. As for the soybean problem, which is so much discussed now, you know, soybean is a rather exotic crop for Russia. Our wheat and rye and corn exports are traditional, and we have bumper crops each year. And of course we can sell soybeans to China. Last year it was about 3 million tons. And we have about 35 million square kilometers of waste land which can be used for crops, but it will take some time to develop those lands. And we also, our farmers must be absolutely sure that China will buy it by the time they develop the land, and not switch back to American farmers. So I don't think that Russia can substitute soybeans imports from America very quickly.
Well, Mr. Liu, your Russian counterpart certainly raised an interesting point. Your response?
Sure. Compared with U.S., China imports very limited soybeans from Russia. But the point is, what about the future? If the trade tensions continues, with if the growth rate of China's import from Russia continues, that will have significant relevance in the future. In the long run, we know Russia is a country with a vast territory, and with the global warming, though global warming is not welcome, but actually in terms of agriculture industry, it may bring some good news for Russia. In the future, some frozen land may be fertile in the future. That will be good news for the agriculture in Russia. I think in the long run, this cooperation between China and Russia in terms of soybeans will have can send a signal to the United States. If the unilateralism continues, there will be more and closer cooperation between Russia and China in terms of agriculture.
I see. Well, you know, gentlemen, the reason why China and Russia's relationship means so much of attention for the rest of the world as well has a lot to do with the important international status these two countries have. For example, at the United Nations Security Council, important players on multilateral frameworks, and also on some of the regional frameworks as well. Now, how much can we expect this kind of so-called strategic relationship, both of you emphasize, will be further translated into real cooperation on various platforms, be they international or regional? Mr. Liu, given the fact that though China and Russia sometimes have different issues and different priorities, though, Mr. Liu.
Yes, we have seen very, very good cooperations between China, and yes, and in terms of dispute different views, we can also find some. For example, in terms of the Black Sea area, Black Sea is an area which caused very much concern from the Russia side. But but for China, I have talked to some of my Russian friends that they want China to play an active role in the area of Black Sea. But for China, I think Black Sea is still far away from China. So according to my own understanding, China is still a regional power. It's not very influential in the Black Sea area.
I see. What about for you, Mr. Tavrovsky?
Yes. Same question?
Same question, yes, indeed, sir.
Yes, yes. You know, our cooperation, I believe, is becoming global one. And the recent military patrol of Chinese and Russian strategic bombers under the Sea of Japan proved that. And you know, I'm a specialist mostly in strategic studies, so for me, this sort of cooperation is number one, is very important. But of course, our international cooperation with China goes also to the Africa, to the Middle East, to the North Pole, and I don't see any limits for our bilateral cooperation. Sky is the limit, and even sky is not the limit because we have already cooperation in outer space, in cyberspace, and so, yes.
Well, sky is not even the limit. That is quite a quote. Thank you so much, both of you, helping us to understand the latest status of China-Russia relations. Yuri Tabrovsky and Liu Mingli. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.